streaming from is the unceded territory of Andokana, belonging to the Abenaki peoples, whose cultures and traditions have stewarded this land for thousands of years and continue to this day. We thank them for their strength and resilience in caring for this land, and as a park, we aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Thank you for joining me in this important acknowledgement of land. So my name is Joey Sullivan. I'm the Natural Resources Management intern at both Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historical Park and St. Gaudens National Historical Park. Part of my role at the parks is coordinating these Working Woodlands workshops, which are designed to connect nature enthusiasts and landowners with natural resource professionals to provide them with the skills and knowledge to improve land stewardship. These workshops are co-hosted by our partner, Billings Farm and Museum, and they're co-sponsored by Vermont Coverts and Vermont Woodlands Association. So I encourage you all to check out their websites and see events of a similar interest. Today's workshop, we have Tony D'Amato, a professor at the University of Vermont, who's going to be talking to us about climate change impacts on Vermont forests, how we can expect composition to change, adaptations we can do. So there'll be a little bit of doom, but also a little bit of hope. So hang in there. And I think that covers everything. So Tony, you can take it away from here.
All right. Thanks, Joey, for the introduction, and thanks, folks, for logging on. And Joe, just let me know if you're having any issues with seeing the slides, but hopefully that's coming across as full screen for everybody. And so as Joey mentioned, there will be a bit of gloom today. I apologize. It is a bit of a cloudy day, at least up here in Chittenden County. So not the best topic to brighten your day. But what I'll be doing is talking a bit about, first broadly, some things that many of you are already familiar with, just the changes that are both happening and projected to happen, both in terms of climate and disturbance regimes and what that means for the forests that really form the fabric of much of Vermont and the broader region. And then we'll get into just how people are thinking a bit about adapting to those changes. So understanding those challenges, are there ways for us to manage or adjust what we're doing on a landscape scale to try to minimize impacts. And so before I get further into this, just want to acknowledge, especially Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historic Park, as well as Red Start Forestry, who are partners in some of the work that I'll be talking about later today, as well as other partners with the Forest Service and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science that certainly have been key partners in a lot of what we do, both in understanding climate change impacts, but also how we might respond to that. And so I am going to start with a bit of the gloom. And so when we think about, how we're dealing with both kind of current political and health issues, we certainly can say we have novel and uncertain times, but the same really is true for what's happening with the environment and what we're seeing both in terms of climate regimes as well as disturbances, native insects acting strangely, non-native insects showing up in our landscape, getting mud season in the middle of the winter. All of these things really are without precedent when it comes to our most recent understanding of how forests operate in the region, as well as kind of our historic knowledge of forests in Vermont and elsewhere. And so when we're thinking about managing and conserving our landscapes, we really are doing it in some cases with a high level of uncertainty as to what the future will bring, just based on our observations of the weird weather or other things that are happening across the landscape. And so when it comes to thinking about forests and forest change, particularly in the Northeast, really the key things that we're most concerned with, even though we certainly recognize rising temperatures are a key variable that is concerning, is what's going to happen both in terms of the duration of frozen conditions in our part of the world, as well as the level of moisture we get during the growing season, as well as for those that like to ski during the winter. And so the figure on the left is from the National Climate Assessment. And what it's really pointing to is that in terms of the growing season, the length of the growing season in Vermont and throughout much of New England, if we look at kind of the change in number of days for when we'll have the last spring freeze, so kind of how late into March or April might we see a freeze, as we go forward into the future by 2040, we're going to lose that duration by upwards of 20 to 26 days in the region. So that duration of frozen conditions is actually going to be reducing going into the spring, which is, if you want to get your garden going sooner, maybe that's a good thing. On the flip side, if you rely on frozen ground conditions for doing forestry operations, or if you're thinking about first fall freeze off, also corresponding with when we might be able to reliably make snow and get ski areas going again, we're also seeing into the future, and we've already been observing this, that the onset of that first fall freeze is going to be happening later and later into November, if not occurring until December. And so we're losing that window of time where the ground is frozen. And actually, they've shown that we've lost 4 to 6 weeks of frozen ground conditions already in the Northeast over the past few decades. And so those that rely on harvesting wood out of the forest or just rely on being able to pass over roads and other pieces of ground that are frozen, we're kind of narrowing down that window of time that we're allowed to do that. Likewise, when it comes to precipitation, it's kind of ironic, 10 years ago, if we talked about future droughts in the Northeast, many folks would say, we don't need to worry about it. The Northeast is just going to keep getting more and more rain. But in the past 5 years, we've actually had 2 fairly significant droughts, the last being last summer. This is showing kind of the drought index across much of Vermont, New Hampshire, as well as Massachusetts, where they're basically in a moderate to severe drought, leaving the growing season. And many of us might remember, although it's kind of hard after the rain washed it out of our brains, that this is where we were in April, when we had a very early onset of our growing season, but during a fairly moderate to significant drought again throughout much of Vermont. And so we've been dealing with, in some cases, fairly low levels of precipitation for well over a year. But then, as many of you know, we received some pretty tremendous slugs of precipitation, particularly in southern New England and southern Vermont, where over a very short period of time, beginning in July, we began having 3-inch, 4-inch rain events that really, although we're going to ultimately say that we had a pretty good growing season in terms of moisture availability, the timing and the amount of that rain really was not in sync with what plants need. And so going forward, a lot of our concerns are we're going to be gaining precipitation, but there are going to be these long periods between precipitation events. And when we do get that rain, it's all going to come in one big shot as opposed to evenly distributed across the growing season. So certainly something that's going to impact our forests. But when I think about change and kind of the most pressing changes that are non-human that threaten our forest, really the biggest impacts that we're seeing already and that are going to continue to impact Vermont's forests are those from non-native insects and diseases. And so, this has been an issue in the Northeast since the 1800s. Those of you who know the history of Lamatria dispar, the species we used to refer to as gypsy moth, that was introduced in Boston in the 1800s, and it's been a very important invasive species throughout the Northeast and beyond, and including in parts of Vermont this past summer. But in general, we've really seen over the past several decades, this graph here is showing kind of the cumulative amount of insect pests in the US. But if you look at this dashed line, wood borers, we've seen this exponential increase in the amount of wood borers coming in, like emerald ash borer and Asian longhorn beetle, really in the last couple of decades when the value of imports from global trade has gone up tremendously. And so with global trade, wood packaging being used in pallets and so forth, we're seeing kind of this increasing pressure of more and more invasive species being introduced into our landscape. And all of us today already are managing within the context of emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, hemlock woolly adelgid. I'd like to say that's the last list of species you need to learn and understand. But given these current rates of introductions, they basically estimate we're getting about 0.4 high impact pests per year introduced into the US, just given kind of the current rates of global trade, as well as kind of the inability for us to pass very strict and effective policies to keep this from happening. And so as we think about the future of our forests, as much as I'll talk about climate today, it's really important also to put these changes that are related to novel stressors like emerald ash borer first and foremost in how we're thinking about those dynamics. So I'm fortunate to work with some folks that are not only interested in understanding how forests are changing, but also understanding how those that work in the forest might be changing or at least thinking about change. And this is some work that Rachel Chapman at the University of Maine, Todd Ontel from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, in collaboration with me and some folks here at UVM, have been doing to understand how foresters actually are both perceiving changes as well as kind of their level of adaptation and what they're doing in terms of actions to respond to those changes. And so what this graph is just summarizing are some of the main things that we asked them about. And anything to the right of this dashed line that's yellow or orange kind of indicates that more than 50% of our 124 foresters that we surveyed have indicated that these are things they're either concerned about or very concerned about. And so it goes without much explanation that many of the things I was just describing, like extreme events with wind, losing that snowpack, drought, too much rain, insects and diseases, all are things that foresters in the region are certainly concerned about impacting both their ability to do forestry in the region as well as kind of the future of the forest. as well as things like increasing deer populations and increasing competition from plants, both non-native as well as things like beech that can be a real challenge in the landscape. There's a positive, trying to give you something other than gloom and doom. They're not too worried about fire so far, but that certainly could change depending on what's happening in the landscape. And so collectively, as a resource management community, foresters certainly are observing these things, as do all of you who spend time in the woods, that things are changing and it's going to impact how we manage going forward. But when we think about change, and how that affects our forests, it's always worth understanding and reflecting upon the forest conditions they're currently intersecting with. And so our forests, as many of you appreciate, have just been recovering from a pretty novel disturbance, which was European settlement of the region and kind of mass impact in terms of agricultural clearing and then abandonment and harvesting and all of those things that have really homogenized, in many cases, the forest resource base throughout the Northeast. And so looking at that in terms of ages, this graph on the left is just showing the age of different plots that are inventoried as part of the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, summarized for the Northern New England states. And the yellow and green, which makes up much of Vermont, really points to the fact that our forests really are 60 to 100-year-old on average, pretty uniform across the landscape in terms of their age structure. You can see the blue and even younger in parts of Maine where there's more active forest harvesting and larger scale forest harvesting occurring. But in general, much of our forest is kind of similar in terms of its age class structure. And it's really different, as many of us already appreciate, from what predominated prior to European settlement, where the Abenaki and others were stewards in the landscape, where we know just by understanding of the natural disturbance regimes for the region, that old multi-aged forests really were kind of the common condition across much of Vermont, as well as young complex forests. So forests that not only were young, but also had some complexity to them from wind and disturbances and other things. And so both of these conditions, both old and complex and young and complex, are quite rare. And we kind of have this kind of average condition that's fairly homogeneous, both structurally and in many cases compositionally across much of the region. And so when we look at what that translates into, both in terms of the vulnerability of our forests to change, but also in terms of how it impacts things we care about, like bird diversity and so forth, we've been observing kind of declines in bird diversity and other species diversity, largely given that the lack of heterogeneity across our landscape in terms of forest conditions, as well as, unfortunately, the loss of forest land from our landscape due to conversion to other uses, whether it be houses or solar arrays or other development. And so when we think about all these changes and what's happening on the landscape, a lot of what I'll be getting into is describing how we might actually manage and respond to that. Can we use active forest management and active stewardship both to do things like restore forest habitats that birds depend on, but more importantly, to think about how we might adapt our conditions. But it's critical to also reflect on the fact that we're dealing with another pretty novel and uncertain future. And that reflects something that's a bit unique about Vermont and how we sit as a state. And in particular, when we think about Vermont and our wood use and our wood production and our wood consumption, as much as we're extremely proud and we even give out, gold belts with a fork and knife on them for being kind of localvores when it comes to food production and so forth, when it comes to our wood use, whether it be Amazon packaging, Zappos, Chewy, you name your favorite mail order over the past 18 months, or all the home starts that are happening throughout, or remodels that are happening throughout the state, we really are globalvores when it comes to wood. And so, and increasingly what we're finding and seeing as a prevailing sentiment in parts of Vermont and elsewhere in the Northeast is that we really want to maximize kind of local carbon storage in the landscape by, in many cases, reducing the amount of local harvesting we're doing. But at the same time, we're not necessarily stopping our consumption of forest products. And as many people already know, much of that happening and coming from other parts of the country, like the Pacific Northwest. This is a log yard in Olympia, shipping logs all over the world. Plantations in the Southeast that are producing, almost half the wood that supplies our country. And so when we're looking at adapting and trying to be kind of both local and global stewards as it relates to both conserving resources, but also not displacing social and environmental impacts to other parts of the country and other parts of the globe, Vermont is a bit complicated in that, even though we have lots of forest and relative to other parts of the country, forest that seems to be, fairly well watered and less fire prone in the West, we really are seeing an increasing sentiment around active management being a negative thing even though we continue to consume. And so even though we are champions when it comes to local food production, sadly, when it comes to Vermont in terms of wood production, we only can get maybe a participation trophy because there's only so much of what we're doing that's kind of carrying our weight in terms of producing our own needs. So when we get into adaptation, it's important to focus in on climate change impacts and so forth. But my little diatribe there is to also point out, the social dynamics are changing as well. And that certainly can impact just the degree to which we can even have impact on the landscape and what that might mean. So what I'm going to go through now is to summarize a bit of what we understand in terms of changing forest conditions in Vermont, some broad scale summaries, for the region, and then dig in a bit into some of the research we've been doing, trying to understand how different species may or may not do well in the future and how we might actually manage for that, including thinking about just how we package some of these strategies in a way that are effective to get implemented across the landscape. And so the first thing I'll start with is one that I think many of us are already very well versed in, and that when people talk about changing forest conditions in the Northeast, so this is just based on inventory through the 1990s, but kind of continues to today. Much of the Northeast dominated by northern hardwood as well as spruce fir, mixed wood conditions, and the general expectation, if we were to look at this very coarsely into the future, is that the growing conditions that are favorable for those species are going to decline, become less prevalent, and in general, we'll start seeing growing conditions climatically that are more akin to the ones that are favoring currently species in Pennsylvania and the central Appalachian region, and so oak and hickory and some of those more southerly species. So there's often these exercises where folks kind of look at these two maps and kind of assume that, well, currently maples, birch, beech, spruce, and in 100 years, it's all going to be oak and hickory and all those other things. But hopefully most of us recognize the way to really interpret these maps is more like a zone map. Basically, if I were to plant an oak in 100 years, it might have a higher likelihood of surviving than if I planted a red spruce in that same spot. But nevertheless, what it tells us is that, when we look at changing climatic conditions, we're certainly seeing a shift away from those that really have favored the species that we're most familiar with in the landscape. And so if we zoom in on Vermont, we've been doing a lot of work over the years with the Green Mountain National Forest, trying to understand across that entire landscape how those forests are changing in response to climate change, as well as how they've been recovering over time from historic land use. And so what you're looking at in the left is the output of some modeling that we've been doing, and I'll be talking a bit more about these ecological models later through some of the work we did with Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historic Park, where we're actually trying to understand over time what's the likelihood that different species will actually be able to germinate and establish as a seedling and persist on the landscape. And so I've chosen kind of our 5 signature species in the hardwood forest, including a red oak, just given it's projected to do really well in a lot of people's future climate assessments. What we're seeing over time is just kind of what's the likelihood in any given year that these species could establish. And so the lines I'm tracing right now are both for beech and red maple. And so those are species that have a pretty wide climatic niche and also pretty large seeds. And so over time, we're seeing actually increasingly favorable conditions for those to persist in the landscape. Likewise, my favorite hardwood species, yellow birch, we see this declining probability. So over time, it's becoming harder and harder for that species to establish. Whereas sugar maple and oak have more of this asymptotic type curve that really is showing, fairly high likelihood of establishment, but maybe some slight decline in sugar maple. And so what happens over time with our forests, and as we think about future climate change, we all know the general projections for the Northeast are that we're expected to get more moisture over time. And so what occurs, though, is that even though we're getting more moisture, temperature continues to rise. And so ultimately, we reach this threshold in about 40 years from now, where the temperature gets so high that it creates an evaporative demand. So kind of that demand on moisture, that's so high, it starts creating more droughty conditions. And so even though we're getting a lot more moisture than we might be getting to today, the temperatures are high enough that much of that's being evaporated. And so we start seeing these declines in species whenever we model things forward. Usually, 2050, 2060. So not tomorrow, but in the future, we're going to start seeing more and more challenging conditions. And again, a lot of this speaks to the difficulties of establishing when you have small seeds in a very, very dry environment. So to explore that and understand a bit more about how future precipitation regimes, because as a tree person and a plant person, moisture, it all comes down to moisture and the right amount at the right time and a stable amount. we've been doing a lot of work, in particular, Peter Clark, who just finished his PhD with me here at the University of Vermont, and trying to understand how different tree species might be able to persist and establish over time, depending on the future precipitation regime they get during the summer. So if we do different growing seasons and kind of try to emulate different types of precipitation regimes, how might those trees do? And so what Pete's been doing is he built these kind of hoop houses in a bunch of forest gaps. And then within those, he actually sowed different seeds on different substrates, some on just leaf litter, some on exposed soil. And then within these, captured all the rain that fell and then redistributed it based on 4 different types of future precipitation regimes. One was he simulated a drought. And so you're seeing a close-up of what one of those seed beds look like under the drought regime. In one area, he simulated future precipitation regimes that's very similar to what we had this past summer. So long dry periods, and then in between those dry periods, these episodic high rain events, which overall still result in kind of lower moisture than normal because we have those periods of drought. Control, which is just kind of our average conditions, and then inundation, which would be essentially high levels of precipitation throughout much of the summer. So a couple of years ago, what we had there. And what we found is that there are some species like red oak, American chestnut, American beech, that this is based on each of these bars corresponds to the different precipitation regimes that really are insensitive to the moisture they get. And those that know these species, these are big seeded species. They have large carbohydrate stores. They basically have a lot of energy in that seed that allows them to get a large root out and penetrate down through that soil and ultimately get into a water table that's fairly stable. And these species aren't impacted much by changing precipitation regime in terms of their recruitment. Whereas some of our signature species like sugar maple did not do well in the droughts, did not do well under episodic regimes, really only did well when we had fairly stable moisture or lots of moisture. Similarly, white pine, eastern hemlock, black birch, all those species that are much smaller in terms of their seed mass, really relying on kind of predictable moisture throughout the growing season. And so as we think about our changing precipitation regimes, and even a summer like we just had, it really creates an important bottleneck that's going to favor some species and unfortunately discriminate against others. And so when you look at future projections of the forest, there's a reason why red oak is often viewed as a future climate winner. And much of that deals with its ability to establish and germinate, even under pretty droughty precipitation regimes. So what a lot of this work is pointing to as we think about the future of Vermont and really the future of all forests is that species that are currently present in the landscape might increasingly face difficulty when it comes to both persisting, so forest health issues, increasing stress on mature trees, but also their ability to regenerate and persist in the landscape. And there's been a lot of work. Again, I really recommend those that haven't spent much time looking at the Climate Change Tree Atlas. It's a great collaborative effort the Forest Service has been leading with Lewis Iverson, the lead scientist on this. But they've been evaluating, for the eastern U.S., what's going to happen over time in terms of suitable conditions for different species across the landscape. And so what you're looking at here, this figure has 2 different maps. The one on the left corresponds to potential migration of species, and the one on the right refers to potential infill. And I'll talk about what that means in a moment. And so on the one on the right, what this basically is depicting is that any area that's kind of coded in green has a high likelihood in 100 years to gain many new species based on both proximity to seed sources for those species, as well as future climate changing to favor those species. And so you notice a very high green area is the Northeast, where there's the likelihood based on change that up to 16 to 19 different species might find new habitat in our region, or could find new habitat in our region given changing climate. Again, we're talking about tree species here. On the right side, what they're talking about is infilling. And what this basically means is that a species that's already currently in the forest, but maybe at low abundance, will actually become more dominant over time and fill in the space that's being vacated by maybe species that aren't as adapted to future climate. And so it's not a migration, it's just basically the expansion of a species currently there to fill into that kind of that landscape. And so you'll notice not much green in the Northeast. We don't have a lot of southerly species currently mixed in our forest. You can actually kind of trace out the Champlain and the Connecticut River Valley. There's a little bit of green there, so where we do have some more southerly species. But it's as we get into the Southeast and into the central portion of the Midwest, where there's a tremendous diversity of oaks, hickories, all those species that over time are expected to fill in these places. And so in the Northeast, we really can't just say, well, kind of allow like the yellow birch to take over when the sugar maple dies out. In many cases, a lot of what these models and projections are suggesting is that it's actually species that aren't currently here or are here in very low abundance that are likely the ones that might be favored by suitable conditions. And so because of that, when people talk about adapting to this change, how do I adapt to these projections and all these things I've just laid out in terms of kind of future impacts of climate? One of the prevailing notions that people often have is that, well, we just need to kind of plant the right trees and just keep, kind of move trees north and mass migration and make sure that we're just getting lots and lots of trees out there in a landscape. And certainly the New York Times and Washington Post have picked up on some of these efforts. There's even an earlier Nature story really all about trying to kind of move trees to the right spot and kind of plant our way out of climate change and find a way to kind of beat this novel threat. And I'll certainly talk a bit about planting as one thing that we do need to consider as a way to at least enhance the adaptive response of our forest. But just to put a little bit of cold water on this idea, it's really logistically, obviously socially, operationally, economically, not very likely that we could ever kind of plant our way out of climate change. The ability to re-engineer and, to be honest, re-engineer correctly. We haven't had a good track record already with when we think we have a great engineering solution to an environmental issue, often it kind of blows up in our face. The same would go, so there's reasons to have caution in general. But I want to put it a bit in economic and logistical terms in a second. And what you're looking at here is the area of planted forests and plantations that were established beginning in the 50s in the southeastern US. And those of you familiar with that landscape know that there's a pretty tremendous amount of southern pine plantations, again, much of which we can thank for our Amazon packaging, the cellulose in our toothpaste, et cetera. And so this was a mass transformation of a landscape that was historically agricultural, and they planted it. And even though it looks like a mass transformation, they only transformed about 17% of the entire potential area of the South into plantations. The cost was $400 per acre, and that was invested in by industry. $9 billion were put into this by industry and other timberland investment owners. And so it had tremendous economic incentive behind it, yet it only transformed 17% of the landscape. And so the only reason I'm pointing this out is that when people talk about mass planting and doing high scale re-engineering of our landscape, we already know it's just infeasible to think we can do that. And to be honest, I strongly discourage it, but nevertheless, we're seeing that. And so the direction I'm going to go for the remainder of the presentation is to talk a bit about how we are thinking about adaptation in Vermont's forests and more broadly, throughout the globe, in ways in which we can integrate some of these ideas, like planting species that might be adapted to the future with kind of our current practices. And what I'm going to do to start this is really remind us that we already have a pretty good example of adaptation of our silvicultural practices that have occurred over the past 50 years that I think can at least give us some lessons that are useful as we think forward in terms of how do we adapt to these changes. And so the early lesson in adaptation to novel conditions that I'm going to talk about is beech bark disease, which we tend to basically at this point accept as a part of our landscape. But if you were standing in Vermont in 1960, when it first was showing up in parts of the landscape and completely altering that beech resource, this was pretty novel, pretty drastic, and certainly having major impacts on a very important species that behaved quite differently, like this beautiful, large, smooth beech, prior to many of our beeches looking like this. And so this is something that's been in our forest for decades, if not over a century, if you're in parts of Maine or Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And we've largely adapted to it. Certainly it's a challenge in terms of certain objectives we want to achieve, but in many cases, we do have a fairly straightforward way to deal with beech bark disease in terms of its impact on silvicultural outcomes, especially on sites that are not nutrient-rich sites. And essentially, what has been our adaptation to beech bark disease is what many of us refer to as patch selection, some call group/patch selection. But basically, Bill Leake and certainly many of his colleagues, beginning in the 50s and 60s of the Bartlett Experimental Forest, began to recognize that many of these areas with heavy beech bark disease and also heavy beech sucker sprouts beneath them really presented a challenge in terms of being able to regenerate a desirable ecological mix of species and economic mix of species on those sites. And what they quickly recognized is that on average quality soils, so sites that we might characterize as beech, birch, maple, or just kind of average northern hardwood sites, if we were to do kind of fine scale harvesting, so single tree selection or thinning treatments on these sites, we very much are just going to perpetuate beech dominance and really make this site very much a beech monoculture. And what they very early on published were recommendations that, if you have a site with heavy beech and often heavy beech sprouts due to beech bark disease, your best bet, if your goal is to actually regenerate a desirable suite of species on that site, is to do what they termed group or patch selection, where essentially you create a harvest opening, third acre or larger. You remove all of the pre-existing beech from that site, you do the harvest in the summer or fall, scarify the soil with that harvesting, and essentially, flip that forest to have a higher component of yellow birch, certainly early on, things like pin cherry, paper birch, et cetera, but really kind of adapt to that challenge that beech poses in that landscape. And this is something that anybody that does northern hardwood management is like, of course, that's what you do. But I think we sometimes fail to recognize that this really was a strong adaptation to the impact of beech bark disease on the functioning of our northern hardwood systems. And the reason why this has been so effective, and I think at this point so ingrained in what we do as an adaptation strategy to this historic outcome, is that there is the ability to both demonstrate, that this action has desirable outcomes, both economically, certainly, providing species that have economic value. But a lot of the work that was done around patch selection also included linkages with understanding its positive outcomes on bird responses and other wildlife species. It's done in a way that's operationally feasible. And what's key about this is that it's not for every single site. It's really meant to be catered to local site conditions where you have a high beech component on nutrient poor soils. This is what makes sense. Whereas if I'm looking at soils like this in Orleans County, I'm not going to be doing the patch selection. I'm going to be doing single tree marking and really managing with that site. And so again, I think it's worth just reflecting. We've adapted in the past, but the key is that we want to make sure it's linked to desirable outcomes and that it's consistent with what our goals are for the landscape. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how people have been approaching adaptation to climate change and more broadly, other stressors across the landscape as part of what's known as a climate change response framework, which actually the Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historic Park is part of. There's a demonstration project associated with the site. And this is a project that's led by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. If you go to forestadaptation.org, there's tons of great resources there, including all of these little demonstration sites where you can click on the map and it'll tell you what's happening there and all that's occurring. And so the way we've been using these, besides as research sites, because we certainly are some of the points in this map are some of our silviculture studies, is using it as a way to understand, well, how are managers and other stakeholders and partners internalizing climate change impacts and integrating them into their actual practices on the ground. So how is adaptation actually being implemented? And so what I'm going to do is zoom in actually in the Lake States and kind of the Central Appalachian region and just show some summaries of just how folks are kind of approaching adaptation, and then kind of bring it back to the Northeast and discuss kind of ways in which we might do that here. So some work that Todd Ontel from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science led is they took all of these different studies. These are studies, these are demonstrations on actual, either national forests, state lands, private lands, family forest ownerships, in some cases, dealing with kind of large tribal ownerships as well, and summarize kind of how managers were approaching adaptation. And we kind of put them into these three bins that many of you heard before: resistance, resilience, and transition. And so strategies that are trying to resist change, basically you're doing things that you're trying to improve the defensiveness of that forest against that change. So we often view this as a bit of a near-term strategy, trying to keep that forest as it is, improving the vigor of the trees, doing other things like pulling buckthorn, just trying to resist anything you can that might change that forest from current condition. Moving down the spectrum, we have treatments that are managing for resilience. And so how do we manage that forest in a way that allows it to kind of experience disturbances, experience climate change, but then recover back to some condition that we view as desirable and often within the historic range of variation. And then finally, transition, kind of moving out here to these more, what some might say, extreme approaches, where we are deliberately managing that forest and shifting it to a new condition that we feel is going to be better adapted to future change. And so maybe shifting the structure of that forest, or introducing species or encouraging species that might be better adapted to the future. And so what this table is summarizing is just kind of how folks approach their different projects. Very few are trying to resist change. I think recognizing that at this point, it'd be pretty challenging to resist change depending on the ecosystem you're working with. And instead, many of the strategies folks are using fall kind of into this resilience bin, although in the central interior, down into the Mark Twain National Forest in those spots, there were quite a few folks doing transition. So if we drill in on kind of how folks are actually approaching adaptation as doing management actions, there are some slight differences between regions, but here are kind of the primary strategies that folks are using, and I'll kind of highlight a couple of those just to provide examples. And so one, reducing the impact of biological stressors. There's a higher proportion of folks doing that in the Laurentian mixed forest province, again, which intersects with the Lake States region. That makes sense given this is a part of the US that has had emerald ash borer since the late 90s. And so a lot of the management actions are being done to try to at least reduce the impacts of emerald ash borer in the landscape in that region. Likewise, there was a lot of work, and I'll talk more about this, that how do we take forests just like Vermont's that have been highly simplified by past land use, and can we do things to actually enhance the species and structural diversity in those ecosystems? Can we increase their complexity as a way to hopefully make them more resilient to future change? And then finally, you might notice in the central interior, a lot of transition type treatments, but what this represents, those familiar with that landscape, is that many of their oak forests have become what they call mesified over time. And with the absence of fire, both historic indigenous burning, and then more recently, kind of the use of fire by other managers in the landscape, once that fire is eliminated, maple and other species become quite dominant. And so what they've been trying to do is restore more open conditions, restore fire to that landscape, and transition it back towards these oak woodlands as a strategy to really minimize future climate impacts and so forth. And so the list of what folks are doing in terms of how they're actually thinking about climate change adaptation largely builds from kind of a lot of our understanding of what might be good strategies in general for kind of healthy, complex, diverse forests. And so when we think about adapting Vermont's forests and adapting the region to climate change adaptation and how we think about future impacts, a point I always like to make is that we already have a pretty good template and good understanding of the management approaches that fit with many of these ideas of having multiple species and multiple structures and multiple conditions that allows our forest to be resilient to climate change over time. And many of those draw from a lot of the discussion that began ironically in New England in the 40s, but was really popularized in the 80s in the Pacific Northwest around this idea of ecological silviculture and managing forests for kind of complex conditions, as opposed to the very simple plantations or very simple single species, timber focused model that really had prevailed for much of the 20th century. And so I pulled this quote from a real barn burner, page turner of a book, Douglas First, Dam Management for the Future. But it was very useful for this one quote from a section of that book that was talking about a revolutionary idea in 1986 that can we manage Douglas fir for something other than non-timber, for something other than timber? And really the quote that comes out of this is that, simplification is really beneficial, right? We know that when it comes to ecological systems, simple is very rarely good. And so when I think about adaptation and when we talk about adaptation in the landscape, and certainly the work that's happened at Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historic Park as a model for forest management, a lot of what's happened really over the last decade or so with Red Start Forestry and others, much of what they've been demonstrating are kind of the modern thinking around how we actually manage with ecological silviculture in mind. And in particular, there's two kind of main paradigms within ecological silviculture that have strong resonance with how we're now thinking about adaptation. And those two paradigms and principles revolve around these ideas of managing for continuity as well as managing for complexity. So the idea around continuity is that, when I'm harvesting and working in the forest, I'm doing things and making decisions that are actually providing continuity. So leaving legacies, structures, living trees, dead trees, tip-up mounds that really provide that key system memory that allows that forest to recover and carry forward some of that diversity and some of that complexity into the new regenerating ecosystem. And likewise, I don't need to define it much, but complexity basically implies that in any of our management, we are doing things to deliberately create and maintain complexity and diversity. We're not trying to homogenize and have uniform plantations of the same species with the final output being wood products. we're trying to create complexity by still harvesting wood products, but doing that in a way that's creating these complex conditions. And so if we look at these ideas that really were originally conceived as a way to try to restore and maintain biodiversity, there's a lot of linkages between these ideas with how we're thinking also about uncertainty and adaptation. And so if I'm leaving mature trees behind, leaving dead wood behind, groups of mature trees, standing dead trees, I'm out in the forest when I'm doing management. Yes, many of the things motivating me to do this might be from a biodiversity standpoint, but these structures and these compositional elements also are providing key adaptation pathways that are critical, both, providing spots that might have shade. So if you're out in April in this forest, that hot, dry condition, seedlings and other organisms in these patches of retention are going to have a much different response to that than ones that are happening out in the open. Likewise, leaving things behind, individual species or resistant individuals like a clean beach out in the forest, trying to conserve that genetic diversity as future sources of adaptation across the landscape. Likewise, complexity, trying to create a heterogeneity, so multiple ways that forest can respond to disturbance. So looking at this irregular shelter wood here, where we have open areas, dense areas, thinned areas, all of these have a different response to the environment. And as a result, when we have a wind event or we have a drought or we have a fire or other things or a defoliator impacting this forest, there's a lot of heterogeneity in how this forest is going to respond because we've created multiple nodes within this ecosystem that really are going to have different pathways for response. And so a lot of what we currently do as it relates to ecological silviculture are consistent with adaptation. But as I mentioned, we know that things are changing and we know that certain species are going to be favored in the future versus others. And so there is this need to at least think a bit about, should we be also in some cases introducing or at least increasing the representation of some tree species in the landscape that may actually be better adapted to future conditions. And so to return back to planting, we've been doing a lot of work in Vermont as well as in New Hampshire in evaluating how do some of these tree species do that are projected to do well in the future under climate change. And so what you're looking at is the 3-year results of some work that Peter Clark did for his dissertation, where we looked at 9 different species planted in 3 different locations, one spot in northern New Hampshire, and as well as in Washington and Wolcott, Vermont. And each of these species represents kind of a different form of what folks might consider assisted migration. And so the things that have PE next to them, so big-tooth aspen, black cherry, hemlock, pine, spruce, and oak, those are species that are already currently present in the landscape. So think of these as like infill. And all we're doing is kind of enhancing the representation, so kind of population enrichment, so just kind of increasing the representation, either for restoration purposes in the context of red spruce, or because in the case of red oak, we expect that species to do better in the future. Other species like black birch, American chestnut, bitternut hickory, we're actually kind of nudging those species a bit north of their range. Basically we call that assisted population expansion or range expansion. And so if we look at kind of the initial findings that we're having, most of the species that are doing really well, this is kind of percent survival, are those that really are already present in the landscape at low abundance, and we're now just kind of augmenting their survival, their representation. And so when we look at kind of those species that, even if I look at a map of future climate projections and says black birch is going to do well in northern New Hampshire 100 years from now, planting that species today, it's still going to experience a lot of stress and in many cases, a lot of mortality and other issues. And so there's real challenges sometimes in operationalizing some of these recommendations in terms of getting it out in the landscape. Likewise, on this map on the right is just reminding us of our last really hot, dry spring. And this is when we planted most of our seedlings. And so what normally would have been a really good time of year to have trees in the ground coincided with some extremely hot, dry conditions. And so our survival rates, I think, were impacted by some of this novelty that's impacting our landscape. So to finish up and zoom back into the landscape that at least Joey is sitting in today, I'm going to finish by talking about some work we've done to try to evaluate over a chunk of Vermont, so a 220 square mile area. If we were to start applying more adaptive management strategies in response to climate change, how might the forest change into the future? So this is a collaborative project, again, with Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller, Red Start Forestry, as well as Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation, who provided a lot of key input on how we were kind of setting things up. And really what motivated this is that we worked with Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historic Park and Red Start Forestry to create kind of an updated adaptive forest management plan for their property. And we want to evaluate kind of how do these practices play out across the landscape, and how might this portion of Vermont's forest change in the future under climate change as well as under different management regimes. And so what we did is we tested 3 different scenarios for this landscape. One, just keep managing it as we have been. And so as I mentioned, the landscape is largely dominated by family forest owners. And so much of the management regime in that landscape, based on looking at stewardship plans as well as harvesting reports, is fairly low intensity, often single tree selection, crop tree release, management. And so continuing that and varying that across the landscape over time. The second strategy we looked at was a combination of both resistance and resilience type approaches, where the goal is to increase diversity of tree species naturally. So no planting, just working with what's currently there. Try to increase the diversity of age classes, as well as adaptive responses to climate change. And so using a bit more group and patch selection, so kind of putting in more groups over a quarter acre in size. Then the final treatment that we evaluated and simulated over time with this model was to actually do similar approaches like resistance and resilience, but actually start putting in larger gaps and planting different tree species: red and white oak, black cherry, black birch, shagbark, and bitternut hickory. Importantly, this is all being done within a computer model known as Landis-2. It's not being done on the ground. So this is just kind of seeing how this plays out with kind of a cutting edge landscape simulation model, and then varying kind of how much of this is like happening across the landscape based on what we know in terms of like willingness of landowners to even cut trees, let alone do things like plant and so forth. So we'll start with the current forest in this landscape. And so what you're looking at, just zooming out from the spot, here's Marsh-Billings, this green blob. You can see the plantations here in this forest cover type map. And so this is a map of current forest conditions. So a lot of this orange is sugar maple, and then these red blobs are actually red pine plantations. So again, those familiar with the landscape can certainly orient based on that. And so if we were to let this forest continue to be managed like it is, this landscape to be continue to be managed like it is, but have climate change based on a high emission scenario, what we generally see is this increase in brown, which is really an increase in beech dominance across the landscape. So if you remember what I talked about, large seeded species, really favored by kind of fine scale disturbances. So it should be no surprise, if we continue doing what we're doing, over time with climate change, beech becomes much more prevalent across the landscape. If we apply a bit more of an aggressive strategy where we're doing more of that resilience and transition, you don't need to adjust the resolution on your monitors. Not a huge difference. And what that speaks to is we just don't do a lot of management, right, relative to the landscape scale. But you might pick out that there are these magenta kind of hotspots here that really correspond to those spots where they're planting oak and pine and trying to kind of increase that representation on the landscape. And so if we look at how this landscape changes just in terms of kind of 4 what we call signature tree species, what I have here are different emission scenarios. So if climate kind of continues as it currently is, which we know is very, very unlikely, if we have a raising of kind of the concentration of CO2 4.5 and then representative concentration pathway of 8.5, so even more emissions in the atmosphere. What we generally see with sugar maple is that actually will increase a bit with climate change if it's moderate, but if we have extreme climate change, it declines. Whereas beech, again, it just keeps on going and going and doing better and better as this climate gets more severe and more severe. Hemlock and red spruce, both species, independent of hemlock woolly adelgid, are declining. And so what this speaks to, again, are these small seeded late successional conifers being sensitive, whereas beech really being somewhat insensitive. And what's important is that all of the scenarios we looked at, the overall carbon amount in the forest went down, really speaking to the fact that trees are being stressed and declining and not being replaced by their species. And so to kind of to drive that point home, what you're looking at here is just if we grow these forests forward over time, the different compositional mixes, as well as under current climate, as well as under a projected climate change. And so sugar maple, it's not going anywhere. We see that even under climate change, it's still going to be a part of our forest. What's worth paying attention to is this magenta line here in the business as usual scenario that represents white ash. So we didn't obviously do much with white ash. I mean, we didn't even simulate it dying from old ash forest, so it's just declining over time. in this scenario, this represents the species we're planting. And you'll notice over time that those species actually gain kind of a higher proportion of the landscape. So they're starting to actually kind of occupy a larger area because they're being favored by that future climate. The problem is that we did so little harvesting and so little planting across the landscape that it's not enough to counterbalance the impacts of losing other species from the landscape. And so if we're really serious about adaptation and counterbalancing loss of trees to different stressors and so forth, the results from the work we did with Marsh-Billings, as well as kind of looking at the broader landscape, is that we're going to need to be a bit more aggressive with those actions and kind of be a bit more proactive to some degree in getting different species out there. And so when we think about, planting trees and harvesting trees, we recognize that, people's acceptance of this is going to vary tremendously. And as I said earlier, sadly, as a state, we're seeing less and less acceptance of harvesting in general, particularly on public land, but more broadly as folks are kind of doubling down on maximizing local carbon storage and not kind of factoring in kind of the global aspect of that cycle or the global aspects of our consumptive uses. And so ironically, there's been some historic discussions about how do we balance these conflicting interests. And historically, it was around preserving and maintaining biodiversity. And what was coined, and many of you hopefully are familiar with this, is this idea of the triad. We can't do everything on every single piece of land. And so why don't we instead think about the landscape in kind of three broad categories? In the case of the triad, really the idea was that, we localize our production of wood products on one area. And so in the case of Vermont, we do that in other states and other parts of the country. And then in other areas, we don't do any harvesting. So these are kind of balancing each other's. And then everywhere else, we're doing more kind of progressive ecological silviculture. And so creating this mix of conditions that really allows us to achieve kind of broad goals as it relates to wood consumption, as well as it relates to biological diversity conservation. And so when we think about adaptation, there could be kind of similar ideas in that, not every landowner and not every ownership is going to be open to harvesting, number one, and number two, harvesting and then actually doing things like planting tree species of what's projected to be adapted to the future. But as we look at the future and kind of how things are changing, we know based on kind of responses that there will be value in having those seed sources and having those future adapted species in the landscape. And so part of how we've been thinking about this is that, can we use places like Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller, our public lands, where there's a bit more flexibility and opportunity to both kind of invest in plantings in these areas where they can serve as kind of these source populations in the future as climate's changing, to both colonize other areas as well as to interact with other parts of the landscape where folks might be possibly sowing a few acorns or sowing some white pine, and allow them to interact over time in these functional networks that really are going to be critical for us sustaining that functioning going forward. So when we get into kind of dealing with climate change impacts, I guess I started with gloom and doom. I'll end with a little bit of it that, I think all of us really are concerned and in many cases motivated by this, that we want to have strategies that can adapt. And the key part of those strategies is that they need to be localized. They need to understand kind of the ecology of the site, understand the history of those sites, and also understand that things still need to pay. They still need to be socially acceptable. They still need to be feasible on our landscape. And so there's a real need for us to be developing these strategies and trying them out, on different areas of the region. But a lot of what you'll be doing is not necessarily reinventing kind of these new strategies that are going to be extreme departures from what we've already historically been doing. And in particular, a lot of those ecological silvicultural strategies that are focused on increasing heterogeneity and trying to have complexity in composition and structure are very consistent with what we're thinking about in terms of what might work well for global change. But there is this need for some places and some actions that are what we call transition, this forestry assisted migration, where we are trying to provide these key nodes of function where we are introducing some of these species, or at least increasing their representation as a way to be these future source populations to avoid kind of undesirable thresholds when all current species might be maladapted to future climate, and we don't have seed sources for other species there to take their place. But the key aspect of this is that we're doing it with the system. We're working with our forests. We're not trying to re-engineer them, but the goal is, can we actually increase some functional components in them as a way for future adaptation going forward? So I'll stop with that. Hopefully it wasn't too much gloom and doom, but I want to acknowledge certainly the partners on this again, Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historic Park, Head Start Forestry, Vermont FPR, Green and White Mountain National Forest, Fish and Wildlife Service, Dartmouth College Woodlands, many others that have provided input and allowed us to at least experiment a bit with these approaches in our land, as well as certainly learn a lot from managers as they're trying to address this grand challenge. So I will end with that and take questions that folks might have. I can get out of my share so you can see me squirm.
Awesome. Thank you, Tony, for that really well done and informative presentation. I know us at the park learned a lot from that, so I hope everyone else did. If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat now. I see we already have one that came up earlier in the presentation. Any projections on impact of changing winters?
Yeah, so two things have already come out from a couple of studies where they primarily looked at changing snowpack. So they deliberately removed snow from some areas and kind of decreased the duration of snowpack. Is that we're seeing a lot of fine root damage, particularly on sugar maple, very sensitive to kind of deep freeze. So that, as we all know, like lack of snowpack, particularly as we go into the first frost, can be pretty lethal in terms of getting that deep freeze, and can cause a lot of root damage. And so there has been some work just showing that that's likely to create more stress on sugar maple. And then I'm not a wildlife biologist, but any organism that relies on what they call the subnivean, the zone beneath the snow. So a lot of our small mammals, really rely on that both for insulation, as well as there's also they're hiding from predators. And so that lack of snow, whether it's snowshoe hare or a red-backed vole, there's really some challenges there, and that people have really already been pointing to for predation. But in terms of trees, the real risk is root damage, winter injury. When those trees are kind of losing water because the base of the root system is basically getting frozen, and they're not able to transpire during those periods, can be a real issue. And then I think the big issue too, just what it does to our workforce and logging, you kind of losing those opportunities to do management, and the real cost to landowners, and a cost to loggers to have to put in like infrastructure to deal with mud when you normally aren't dealing with that. So real challenge. In terms of Tim's question, nice to see you, Tim, where you can observe some of the field work that we've been doing. So we have certainly one experiment that we just had a tour at the as part of the Green Mountain Division of SAF in Corinth, Vermont, where we've been planting, really looking at managing for emerald ash borer, but more broadly climate change impacts. We also have a experiment at the second college grant and Dartmouth College Woodlands, as well as several that are coming online, one in the Mohegan Basin, one on Groton State Forest, as well as at Washington Research Forest in Washington, Vermont. There's some trees there, including some very happy bitternut hickory that we planted a few years ago that we're kind of monitoring over time, both to understand how they do under current climate, but also looking at browse impacts and other things happening out there. So definitely a lot of spots, and I'd be happy if folks wanted to organize something to do some tours to those spots. So in terms of the Penny's question, two things on the planting trees. It's kind of it's interesting, a lot of folks, and we're talking about climate change, but in terms of like putting trees out there that are adapted to the future. But as many of you have gotten wind of, there are a lot of these initiatives now, like trillion tree and billion tree, and planting trees for climate. And so few of those actually acknowledge what the capacity is for seedling production to meet those needs, and let alone seedlings that are locally adapted or even that are fine-tuned to the future climate regime. And so one of the issues, Penny, with planting is just finding the right species that you can get that are locally suitable for your landscape. But I hate to keep going back to it, but northern red oak, seems to be a pretty safe bet. I mean, if you're on a site that was more of a mixed wood, I'm still a fan of red spruce. In many cases, it's a temperate conifer. It's not a boreal species. A lot of it's a reduction of habitat is more us. We cut a lot of it out of the woods, and now we're seeing a recovery of that. And so that's also a species we're trying to restore to a lot of areas. But in terms of hardwoods, red oak and the state of New Hampshire, their state nursery produces great red oak seedlings. If it's more of a conifer site, white pine is another one that is well adapted to future climate and is locally adapted. bitternut hickory, it's hard to get a local source of that. The bitternut hickory we've been planting comes from Alpha Nurseries, which is a major supplier of seedlings for folks in the Northeast, and they're based out of Michigan. So it's not necessarily going to be a local seed source. And bitternut hickory, as much as I like it as a species, does have some disease issues when you get on its range margin. So, I, if nothing else, red oak I feel like is pretty solid recommendation, and you can get good local sources for that. And so I think to your question, and the 1 acre woodlot, in some cases, those are places the scale is right to do two things. One, you can resist change, like when it comes to invasives. Those are places where you might actually be able to control the level of invasives on your property because it's an acre versus 320 or more. And so trying to at least minimize kind of the source population that you could become with those species, but also given it's an acre, you might have the opportunity to plant some trees, like you're in Woodstock. So I would say red oak, bitternut hickory could be viable. The American Chestnut Foundation is always looking for places to put their seed as well. And there, given it's 1 acre, you have the ability to kind of keep an eye on it, nurture it along. And the goal is, when I'm talking about these plantings, it's not that we're like trying to plant entire hillsides with new trees. Is that we have these pockets of trees. It could be 2 or 3 red oak that in 50 years are producing acorns that can be really value source populations over time as that forest is changing. That allows those hopefully to kind of establish elsewhere in the landscape and really serve as a key aspect of adaptation. I think it's, as we all know, a lot of folks, we're just going to replant new mixes, and that's just not a recommendation I would have. And so so your 1 acre could actually be very important if it happens to have those species on it.
Great. Thank you, Tony. I don't see any other questions in the chat. If anyone has any lingering questions, you can put them in now, but just want to take a moment to thank you all for attending today's workshop. Tony, thank you for presenting and all the great work you're doing. We do have 2 upcoming workshops. October 27th, we'll have a workshop on bat conservation, focusing on research done on bats from Dartmouth College. And November 17th, we'll have a workshop with Hannah Dallas, Southern Windsor County Forester, giving us an overview of common tree pests, signs and symptoms, and what you can do about those. So email me if you'd like more information on that. You can register using the same form. And if there are no other questions, good timing, it's 1:03, so we can wrap up now. So thank you all for attending today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Nice connecting.
I'm going to end the Zoom now. Thanks again, Tony. Really appreciate it.
No problem, Joe. See you later. Look forward to seeing you in person. See you.